Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, after everything James, Diep, and little Nye have been through, this episode slows things down and takes us somewhere quiet. What begins as a simple fishing trip turns into something much deeper, a moment of rest, reflection, and emotional healing. From the calm sound of flowing water to the warmth of a small fire at dusk, this story isn't about big events or dramatic twists. It's about peace after chaos, about finding safety in small moments, and about the quiet bond that forms when three hearts finally have room to breathe. Stay until the end to feel how calm can be just as powerful as survival. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The riverbank opens up under a soft wash of morning sunlight, the kind that doesn't rush you, the kind that makes everything feel slower and lighter at the same time. The water flows gently, making a quiet rhythmic sound as it slips over smooth stones, almost like it's humming to itself. After everything they've been through, this place feels like a pause button on life. Nye squats close to the edge of the river, her tiny hands busy picking up shimmering shells and smooth pebbles. Every so often, she lifts one up to the light, turning it over with serious concentration, as if she's inspecting a treasure. Her eyes keep drifting toward the narrow path leading down from the trees, waiting, clearly waiting, for Uncle James to appear. Fishing, in her mind, can't truly begin until he's here. A few steps behind her, Diep sits on a flat rock near the grass. She holds a small knife, peeling a large, vibrant red watermelon. The blade glides smoothly along the green rind, and with each slice, the sweet scent spreads through the air. She cuts the fruit into neat triangles and places them carefully on large leaves she's laid out like plates. Every move is calm and unhurried. "Nee, do you want some watermelon?" Diep asks gently, her voice soft but cheerful. Nee looks up, eyes instantly lighting up. She nods hard, almost too enthusiastically, then scampers over, careful not to slip on the damp stones. Diep smiles as she hands her a piece, watching closely to make sure the juice doesn't drip all over her clothes. Moments like this, small, ordinary, quiet, feel unusually precious today. A rustling sound comes from the trees, followed by footsteps. Nye freezes, then spins around. "Uncle James!" she calls out before she even sees him. James emerges from the brush, carrying a woven basket slung over his shoulder. His pants are smeared with mud, dried in patches along his calves, and his hands are dark with soil. He looks a little worn, but his smile is wide and relaxed. "I had to go all the way to the other side," he says, lifting the basket slightly. "The flood washed all the worms away over here." Diep stands up immediately, concern flickering across her face. "Look at you. You're covered in mud. Come here. Let me wipe that off." James laughs and shakes his head. "It's fine. I'll clean it myself. Don't worry." He sets the basket down and walks toward the water, rinsing his hands and brushing off his pants. Diep watches him, still slightly worried, but there's something warm in her expression too. It's not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet, unspoken care that's been built over time. Once he's cleaned up, James starts unpacking the fishing gear. He takes out 2 rods, a small, colorful one clearly meant for a child, and a longer, sturdier rod for himself. He kneels down beside Nye, holding up the small rod. "This one's yours," he says. "We'll go for tiny fish first, okay?" Nye's eyes widen. She nods again, gripping the rod with both hands like it's the most important thing in the world. James carefully ties on the line, attaching a small sinker and hook. He moves slowly, deliberately, explaining each step as he goes. Even though Nye mostly just watches in awe, still, he pauses now and then. "Do you think this hook is too big?" he asks her seriously. Nye leans in, squints, then shakes her head with authority. "No." James chuckles. "All right then, we trust you." Diep watches from a short distance, arms loosely crossed, a faint smile playing on her lips. After days filled with stress and uncertainty, seeing James so relaxed and Nye so happy makes something in her chest ease. Soon, all the rods are ready. The three of them spread out along the bank. James steps a bit farther downstream, where the water runs deeper and darker. Diep stays closer to the edge, choosing a spot where the current is gentle. Nye sits between them, feet tucked in, her small rod resting carefully across her knees. Lines are cast. The floats land softly on the water's surface, sending out tiny ripples that quickly fade. At first, the air is filled with anticipation. Everyone watches their floats closely, as if staring hard enough might will the fish to bite. Nye barely blinks. Minutes pass. Nothing. James glances over at Diep. "Any luck?" Diep shakes her head slowly. "No. I can see the fish swimming, but they're not interested at all. They're clever today." There's a hint of disappointment in her voice, but it's gentle, not heavy. James lets out a quiet sigh, adjusting his grip on the rod. "Looks like they're not hungry," he says. "Or maybe they're just ignoring us." The floats bob slightly, teased by the current, but never enough to signal a real bite. Slowly, the initial excitement softens into something calmer. No one speaks for a while. They just sit there, listening to the water, the wind brushing through the leaves overhead. Dry leaves drift past on the surface, carried away without resistance. It feels symbolic somehow, like expectations being gently swept downstream. The idea of a big catch fades, replaced by the simple act of being here. The sunlight filters through the trees, breaking into shifting patches of light and shadow across the water. It's beautiful in a quiet, understated way. Even without fish, the moment feels complete. As the afternoon wears on, the temperature begins to drop. A cool breeze slides along the riverbank, making Nye shiver slightly. James notices immediately. "All right," he says, standing up. "Time for a fire." They gather some dry branches and driftwood from farther up the bank. James stacks them carefully, striking a spark until a small flame catches. Soon, the fire grows, crackling softly, sending thin streams of smoke into the air. James lifts Nye onto his lap, adjusting her position so she's close enough to feel the warmth, but not too close to the flames. Diep wraps an extra jacket around the child's shoulders, her movements instinctive and gentle. Only a few small fish lie beside them, barely enough to call it a catch. James shrugs. The water warmed up earlier today. The bigger ones probably swam downstream where it's cooler. Diep kneels beside the fish. "I'll clean them. Your hands are cold." James doesn't argue. He looks around for a flat stone to grill on, but finds none. After a moment, he laughs and grabs some skewers instead. "We'll improvise," he says. The flames glow brighter as the fish begin to cook, their scent mixing with the smell of burning wood. Nee sits quietly on a log, feet propped up to keep them clean, watching the fire like it's a living thing. The cold air presses in from the outside, but the space around the fire feels warm and intimate. Fishing may not have gone as planned, but somehow that no longer matters. For the first time that day, a deep sense of peace settles over them. Quiet, steady, and real. The fire no longer burns high, but it hasn't gone quiet either. It settles into a slow, steady glow, embers pulsing gently like a living thing that refuses to disappear too quickly. The warmth spreads outward in soft waves, just enough to keep the cold at bay. Beyond that circle of light, the night thickens, wrapping the riverbank in darkness. Still, the river's voice remains, low, steady, patient, flowing beside them as it always has, indifferent to human worries, yet strangely comforting. James crouches near the fire, turning a thin stick between his fingers. He nudges a piece of wood closer to the embers, not because the fire needs it, but because the motion gives his hands something to do. Tonight feels delicate, like a moment that could vanish if treated carelessly. He wants to stretch it, to let it breathe. Diep sits a short distance away, legs folded neatly beneath her. She smooths the large leaves they've been using as plates, brushing away crumbs and fish scales. It's a small, almost meaningless action, yet it feels grounding. Every simple task tonight feels important in its own quiet way. Nye sits between them, much calmer now than before. Her earlier excitement has softened into a quiet curiosity. She stares into the embers, watching them glow brighter, then dim, then glow again. The firelight reflects in her eyes, giving them a depth far beyond her age. "Uncle James," she asks suddenly, her voice small but serious, "why does the fire change colors?" James smiles, thinking for a moment. "Because it's using up its strength. When it's strong, it's bright. When it's tired, it gets darker." Nye nods thoughtfully. "So, it's like people?" Diep smiles at that, glancing at James. "Yes," she says softly, "just like people." The idea seems to satisfy Nye. She hugs her knees and continues watching the embers, as if she's just learned a secret about the world. The watermelon is gone now, leaving only faint sweetness in the air and sticky traces on their fingers. James wipes his hands with a cloth and leans back slightly, resting his weight on his palms. His shoulders drop in a way they rarely do. For once, he isn't bracing himself for the next problem. They sit in silence for a long time. It's not awkward, it's full. The fire crackles softly. Insects hum around them. Somewhere in the distance, something rustles in the undergrowth. Life goes on, quietly. James is the one who breaks the silence. His voice is low, almost hesitant. "There were days when I thought we'd never sit like this again." Diep looks up at him, attentive. "What kind of days?" "The ones where everything felt unstable," he says. "Where even standing still felt dangerous. Like something bad would happen if we relaxed." Diep nods slowly. "I remember waking up already tired. Not physically, just tired inside." James turns to look at her. "You never showed it." She lets out a small, humorless laugh. "I didn't know how." That honesty settles between them. James stares into the fire, watching an ember collapse into ash. I used to think peace meant control, he says after a moment. Having answers, having plans. And now? Diep asks quietly. And now I think peace is not needing answers all the time. Diep considers that, her gaze drifting toward the river, letting things exist without fixing them. James nods. Yeah. A breeze moves through the trees, cool and gentle. Nye shivers slightly and instinctively scoots closer to Diep. Without hesitation, Diep wraps an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The motion is so natural she doesn't even seem to notice she's doing it. James does notice. Something tightens in his chest. Not pain, but gratitude. He reaches for the remaining fish bones and gathers them neatly, making sure nothing sharp is left behind. Even small responsibilities feel meaningful tonight, as if order itself is a form of respect. Diep speaks again, her voice softer than before. I used to be afraid of quiet. James looks at her. Why? Because quiet made me think, she says honestly, and sometimes my thoughts were louder than any noise. James exhales slowly. I know that feeling. But tonight, she continues, quiet feels kind. James smiles faintly, like it's not demanding anything from us. Nee yawns suddenly, long and unrestrained. She tries to cover her mouth, but it's too late. Her eyes water slightly. Diep chuckles. Someone's losing the fight. I'm not sleepy, Nee insists weakly, shaking her head. James raises an eyebrow. You sure? She nods again, then sways forward slightly. Diep steadies her instinctively. That's enough, James says gently as he stands. He lifts Nee into his arms with practiced ease. She resists for half a second, then relaxes completely, her head settling against his chest as if it's the most natural place in the world. Her breathing slows almost immediately. Diep watches, her expression softening completely. She removes her jacket and drapes it over Nee, tucking it carefully around her shoulders and neck, making sure no cold air slips in. She always sleeps like that, Diep whispers. Once she feels safe. James looks down at the child in his arms. I'll always make sure she does. They stand there for a moment, neither in a hurry to move. The firelight flickers, casting long shadows behind them. Diep reaches out unconsciously, brushing a strand of hair away from Nee's forehead. She trusts you, Diep says quietly. James swallows. That means more than anything. The fire has faded almost completely now, reduced to glowing embers. James kneels again, carefully spreading them apart so they cool faster, making sure nothing could spark later. His movements are deliberate, responsible. As he stands, Diep notices his feet again, still streaked with dried mud from earlier. You're really going to walk back like that? She asks. James shrugs lightly. I've walked worse. She doesn't argue. Instead, she grabs the bottle of water and kneels slightly. She pours the water slowly over his feet, loosening the dried mud, then wipes them clean with a cloth. Her movements are calm, unhurried, intimate, in a way that doesn't need explanation. James freezes for a moment. You don't have to. I know, Diep says gently, but I want to. Those words settle heavily between them. Not dramatic, just honest. When she finishes, she stands and brushes her hands together. James meets her eyes. Thank you, he says quietly. The night air sharpens, the warmth from the embers barely noticeable now. James adjusts knee in his arms, holding her closer. "We should go before it gets colder," he says. Diep nods, packing up their things slowly, carefully, as if she doesn't want to disturb the calm. Before leaving, she turns back toward the river one last time. "It's strange," she murmurs. "After everything, this place still feels gentle." James follows her gaze. Maybe it remembers us. They start up the narrow path, footsteps slow and careful. James leads, mindful of the sleeping child. Diep walks beside him, close enough that their shoulders brush now and then. Neither pulls away. Halfway up, James stops and looks back. The river glimmers faintly below, unseen but heard, steady and constant,